Hello, everyone. Tonight we return not to warm castles or banquets in candlelight, but to cabins full of smoke and frozen earth. That is winter in the Middle Ages, the real one. Without glory, without armor. Only peasants who struggle to survive months of cold, hunger, and silence. Snow accumulated on the roof. The bread turned to stone. The wolves approached. And every day, you got up and started again. If slow and realistic history helps you relax, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it really brings you peace. And tell me in the comments where you listen from and what time it is there. It is strangely comforting to know who else is out there. So, lower the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum. Wrap yourself in something warm. And let's start in a season that not only tested people, but try to end them. You don't need a calendar to know when winter arrives. You feel it first in your bones. They harden like day-old bread. Then in the sky, which goes from blue to a reluctant gray. And finally, in the animals who begin to look at you suspiciously, as if they knew something you don't, and usually that's so. Autumn does not end. It retreats slowly. The leaves fall, of course, but it's not just that. It is the way that the wind changes direction. It begins to sneak through the cracks in the cabin, exploring the place like an unwanted guest, snooping around, looking for where the heat is and dislodging it. The hens become quieter. The dog stops barking at the wind and begins to listen to it. That's how you know it's almost time. The sun, when it appears, feels weak, as if it has forgotten how to give warmth. And everyone walks a little faster. Not because they are in a hurry, but because now being still hurts more. There are no big announcements or snowstorms with great fanfare. Winter arrives like a debt, silently and with great consequences. The first task is always denial. You pretend that the cold is temporary, a chill, nothing more. You put on the same tunic you wore in October, but now with a layer that is more whole than fabric. You tell yourself that you will fix it. You won't. Not because you're lazy, but because the needle is bent and you run out of thread and your fingers are too numb to hold either. We talk a lot about preparation, as if we were always ready. But let's be honest, most winters arrive when we haven't quite finished autumn yet. There is always a corner of the roof that you wanted to fix or firewood that you wanted to cut. There's always something left in the garden that did not dry, was salted or stored in time. Even so, you do what you can. You fill the holes in the wall with straw. Cover the entrance with fabrics. You rearrange the beds so that everyone sleeps a little closer to the fireplace. Even Uncle Gain, who smells like sheep and talks in dreams of debts that no one remembers. You don't light the fire all day. That is a luxury indeed. The firewood is for the afternoons, for cooking, and for the time when everyone more or less pretends to be happy. The rest of the time, you depend on movement, on layers of clothing, and on the heat of several reluctant siblings huddled under a rough blanket. The animals perceive it too. They stay longer near their refuge. The hens all huddle together. The pigs shut up, which feels disturbing. The cows become more irritable, or rather, they remain exactly the same. Outside, the ground turns to iron. The roads that were muddy are now treacherous. Half-frozen furrows that twist ankles and swallow boots whole. The water in the bucket forms an icy layer. Every morning, you break it with a ladle and then curse under your breath when your hands go numb. And the sky is simply there, low, gray, expectant, as if it were waiting for something. You look at it squinting, as if you could read it from messages in the clouds. They don't carry them, but it does mean that you won't see the sun again for several weeks. In the city, people walk faster now. They speak in shorter sentences. The jokes all run out. No one is really in the mood now. Even the church sermons become gloomier. The priest reminds you that cold is how God encourages humility. You wonder if God could try a warmer lesson. And then, finally, one morning it just happens. Snow. Not a blizzard, not yet anyway. Just a little bit, like flowers scattered across the fields. But it changes everything now. The thatched roof turns white, the trees harden, your breath comes out in small clouds, and every step you take outside sounds like you're stepping on old parchment. And with the snow, the realization that you are now locked in. The earth has closed up shop for this season. Digging is over. planting is over too. Nothing will grow now. What you have stored is all you get. And if you haven't stored enough, you'll learn how thin stew can get. You start counting things differently, not in days, but in packages now. How many packages of firewood remain? How many sacks of grain are left? How many turnips are there? How many eggs this week will we get? Not many, since the hens stop laying when cold. They prefer to huddle near the fire, just like everyone else. You keep busy, even though nothing feels productive. You mend all clothes. You scrape out the pans. You stir the ashes, hoping a hot coal is hidden there. If there is time, and there usually is, you spin wool. It's not just for making new clothes. It is to keep hands busy and the mind distracted. Too much tranquility, and thoughts start giving ideas. Animals are not just company. They are cohabitating companions. The warmest are welcome to enter. Not all at once. There are limits, after all, enough to turn the house into a communal stew of smells, sounds, and shared body heat. You get used to waking with a goat breathing on your neck. Well, maybe you don't get used to it, but you stop fighting it. The afternoons are the worst. The sun sets too soon, and darkness arrives as if angry about something. Candles are expensive. Tallow lamps give off much smoke. You sit near the fire, if there is one, and listen to stories, the wind, the crackling firewood as it burns. Sometimes, someone gets it in their head to tell a ghost story. It always seems like a good idea until you realize you have to cross the icy courtyard to the privy afterwards. You run. You try not to trip. You don't look at the shadows under any circumstances. And yet, winter is not just misery. It has a rhythm, a bitter predictability. You know the tasks. You know the limits. And there is strange camaraderie in knowing that everyone else is unhappy. You learn to find comfort in small victories. Having warm feet for 5 minutes. A stew that tastes less like despair. A windless day that sneaks through cracks in the wall. You celebrate in silence because, as soon as you laugh too loudly, someone reminds you that we have only just begun. Historically, peasants did not fare well in winter. The Little Ice Age that began around the 14th century brought harsher, longer winters to all of Europe. The rivers froze, and harvests were lost. In some years, the Rhine froze for months, and markets were held on the ice. Yes, people bought on frozen rivers until the ice decided otherwise. In particularly bad years, such as between 1315 and 1317, rain ruined the harvest for seasons. It wasn't just cold, it was famine. Up to 30 million people were affected. And when there is no food, people become imaginative. There were rumors of cannibalism and even infanticide. It was not a topic of conversation at the table, but it isn't that we always had dinner either. But that's what winter is like. It's not just about enduring cold. It's about enduring each other. A family of 6, 3 goats, 2 chickens, and a bucket of salted fish sharing 20 square feet of space. It is a social experiment with no way out. You hear every cough, every complaint, every digestive misfortune. Intimacy becomes a myth. Modesty disappears with sunlight. You did everything possible not to argue, not out of patience, but because that stirred the air and let in more cold. And so you got used to it. You reduced your world to meters around the fire. You learned the weight of each blanket, the creak of each board, the rhythm of time. The days were getting shorter, the nights were getting longer, and time was beginning to dissolve into a kind of frozen soup. You didn't exactly live. You endured. And, in the end, you stop wondering how long the winter will last. You simply wake up each day and survive that day. If you're lucky, the firewood lasts. If you are very lucky, the roof does too. Because in a medieval winter, the cold doesn't knock on the door. It comes in and stays a while. And tomorrow, it starts again. Winter doesn't just try to kill you with cold. It kills you with the household tasks. And at the top of that list of frozen tasks is firewood. An infinite amount. You don't just need a few logs to set a mood. You need firewood as if your life depended on it, because it does. Everything revolves around fire. Cook your food, warm your bones, dry your socks, scare away the rats, and make the house a little less uninhabitable. Without it, you are not a peasant. You are a poll for taxes. But the fire does not appear by magic. It takes a lot of firewood. Cut, transported, chopped, stacked, and cursed. Collecting firewood is the medieval equivalent of having a second full-time job, except that this one is paid with back pain and freezing temperatures. There is no chainsaw. There is nothing that runs on gasoline. Just an axe that has been in the family for so long that you don't know if it's a tool or a relic. The handle is cracked. The blade is dull, but it is still better than using your hands, which, let's face it, you will probably end up using when the axe gets stuck in the third log. You start in autumn. Of course, everyone says that. Start early. Except there is never enough time. The harvest is delayed. Your neighbor borrowed the axe from you, and you twisted your ankle trying to escape an angry goose. So here you are, in December, wielding the steel against a tree as if it had insulted your mother, praying it falls in the right direction. And the trees do not cooperate. They are heavy, unpredictable, and covered in snow. Cut one, and you realize that you still have to chop it, transport it, and stack it. Repeat 50 times. If you are lucky, only your back hurts. If not, the tree will fall on you, and you will become a role model. Once the firewood is cut, it must be left to dry. That takes months. So you burn it wet, which means that it smokes, hisses, and barely burns. Congratulations. You had just turned your house into a warm, smoky nightmare. I hope you weren't planning on breathing well this winter. The rich, of course, have options open. They hire others. They send their servants to the forest while they drink wine in front of a crackling fireplace. You are the servant, and your fireplace is, for the most part, a pile of wet branches doing what they can. Legally, it is not even allowed to collect firewood in some places. The forests belong to the feudal lords. And if you are caught collecting firewood in noble lands, the punishment ranges from fines to beatings, to being made an example for picking up sticks. Yes, seriously. That is why many peasants resort to alternatives. Things like peat, dry animal manure, or bundles of scrub. Technically, these burn in the same way that, technically, soup counts as food. The peat gives off heat, but also a smell of damp ashes and regret. The manure burns surprisingly well, but let's not pretend that anyone is happy about it. Even so, what you have gets used. You pick up dry droppings with frozen hands and pretend you are not inhaling memories of last summer's pastures. The good news is that it is free. The bad news is that your cabin now smells like a bonfire inside a barn. Stacking firewood is an art. If you stack it too tight, it gets moldy. If you stack it too loose, it falls and breaks a toe. So you build a neat pile against the wall of your house. You wrap it with any tarp you can steal from your cousin and hope it doesn't collapse under the snow. It will collapse, and you never have enough. That is the golden rule. No matter how much firewood you cut, it is never enough. In February, you end up burning fence posts, old furniture, or anything that vaguely resembles wood. There are no sentimentalities. If it burns, it is fuel. You dream of firewood. You count logs instead of sheep. You argue heatedly about who burned the best log too soon. You ration the embers. You treasure the embers as if they were a treasure. And if you manage to find an especially dry branch under the snow, you take it home as if it were a war trophy. Sleeping in winter is a lottery. If the fire goes out, the indoor temperature drops to such an extent that you hope you have written your will. You huddle under layers of blankets, furs, and other human beings. Not because you like them, but because survival is more important than personal space. In some homes, livestock also sleeps inside, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Hens provide eggs and ambient heat. Pigs are radiators with hooves. Cows are basically heaters that moo. It is not cozy. It is a crowded, noisy place that smells like a collapsed interactive zoo in a soup kitchen. But it is slightly better than freezing to death. Historically, peasants did not depend only on their personal effort. Communities used to work together to cut and transport firewood. It was not so much about creating bonds as about sharing the suffering. Everyone had blisters. Everyone was cold. Everyone was equally miserable, which made it easier to bear. In some regions, people used tricks for saving firewood. Mud ovens were shared. Community fires were kept burning all day. They took turns baking bread in the village oven, while pretending not to notice how warm Agnes' house always seemed. In fact, suspiciously warm. Women and children gathered firewood, not because it was easier, but because that was how work was divided. If you were small and had fingers, they sent you to the forest with a basket and told you not to return empty-handed. What you brought could be twigs or pine cones. Either way, you contributed. And then there is the act of cutting itself, a deeply medieval type of misery. Your gloves, if you have them, get soaked within minutes. Your fingers go numb. The axe slips. The firewood splits badly. Something hits you on the shin. You scream, not because it does any good, but because it's the only thing left. Halfway through the break, the ground is too hard for cutting. You have more splinters in your hands than skin, and you still haven't figured out where half the wood pile has disappeared to. Spoiler, your neighbor borrowed it again. And yet, you keep going because fire is essential. It is heat. It is food. It is the difference between reaching spring or becoming the reason your cabin smells even worse. When you sit by the fire at night, tired, sore, and slightly smoky, you feel something akin to peace, not comfort, just the absence of immediate doom, which in the Middle Ages is the closest thing you can aspire to. Of course, some winters are worse than others. Do you remember the bad ones by name? The winter of 43, when the roof collapsed, or the long freeze, when the river turned to stone and everyone tried ice skating with wooden skates. Some did not succeed. A few froze. Others left and never returned. After a while, you stop asking questions. The firewood runs out. The wind whistles. You are surprised to look at the furniture with new eyes. That stool that you never liked suddenly seems flammable. Sentimentality gives way to survival. If it burns, it has value. In the end, autumn arrives. The snow retreats like a tired thief. The mud returns. Your boots disappear somewhere. But you have made it. You have survived another medieval winter without running out of firewood, without freezing to death, and without strangling your cousin for stealing your best log. That is the victory. Without medals, without parades, only frozen fingers, a permanent smell of smoke, and the deep satisfaction of knowing you're on a pole. At least not this year. And the next morning, you start again. Because although spring approaches, the cold persists and the tasks never end. And the fire, that capricious, flickering god, always wants more. More firewood, more sweat, more of yourself. And you give it to him. Because in the end, it's not about comfort. It's about surviving. One splinter at a time. And tomorrow, the same routine. Cut, stack, burn, freeze, repeat. Winter is not defeated, but survived. And if you are lucky, the axe won't break before your spirit next year. Because in the end, winter does not care how tired you are. The logs don't cut themselves. The fire does not feed itself. And the heat, that scarce, fleeting thing you have to earn every day. You don't need a calendar to know it's winter. The stomach is the one that tells you first, loudly, and repeatedly. It is not hunger in the modern sense. That soft roar reminds you that you have to look in the fridge. It is deeper and angrier. The kind of emptiness that makes you look at the bark of a tree and ask yourself, could I cook that? Food in a medieval winter is like firewood. It always runs out, is never easy to get, and is a sure reason for arguments. Meals are not planned, but rationed and lengthened. You look at 3 wrinkled turnips and call it a feast. You start with what you have stored. Cereals, especially barley, rye, oats, wheat if you are rich or steal it from someone. You keep them in sacks, barrels, or anything that keeps the rats away, which is nothing. Rats always find their way. They're like furry tax collectors with teeth. Most meals revolve around stew, the mysterious medieval stew. It is not so much a recipe as a lifelong experiment. Everything edible is thrown in, and you hope it doesn't kill you. Tubers, dried beans, wilted vegetables, maybe a strip of dried pork if you have connections or a generous neighbor. It simmers for days, even weeks. New ingredients are simply added to the pot. The old ones never leave completely. It tastes like boiled earth with a hint of onion and regret. You eat it anyway, every day, twice a day if you're lucky, not because you like it, but because it's there. And in winter, that is enough. Meat is scarce. You don't have a freezer. You don't even have a cold cellar, just a slightly less horrible corner in the cabin. If you killed something in autumn, a pig, a goat, your neighbor's least favorite chicken, you salt it, smoke it, dry it, and then hide it from everyone in the house, especially the children. Children eat anything, even raw bacon and the rope you tied it with. Sometimes you fish if the river is not frozen, if the ice is not too thick, and if you have not already burned your fishing rod for firewood. Ice fishing is common, but not fun. You make a hole in the ice while your fingers gradually lose feeling. Then you sit, wait, and contemplate how life became a series of increasingly stupid decisions. If you're near sea, you might dry herrings or smoke eels. It is nutritious, lasts long, and tastes exactly as it sounds. If you're not near water, you depend on what your neighbors have not kept well. Bread is essential, but also a risky bet. It is made with any flour you have, rye, barley, sometimes lentils, and often it is filled with some ingredient to give it more volume. Sawdust. Yes, ground acorns, maybe bark in a bad year. The bread is not soft or fluffy. It is a blunt object, something between food and a medieval weapon. And sometimes the bread rebels. In humid places, rye can develop a fungus called ergot, a microbe that causes hallucinations, seizures, and sometimes death. You don't know it. All you know is that bread makes you see colors, shout at the clouds, and possibly become a religious visionary or a sorcerer, depending on who is watching you. Dairy products help if you have animals that have not frozen, been lost, or been devoured. Milk spoils quickly, so you turn it to butter or cheese. The cheese is hard, salty, and vaguely threatening. Butter is luxury. You keep it wrapped in cloth hidden under the bed, as if it were gold, because in winter it is basically the same as eggs. It is not probable. Hens get slower and cold. They are too busy trying not to die. Maybe you get one a week, or two if you talk nicely to hens and threaten the rooster. That egg goes into stew, where you stare at it long enough to fill yourself with imagination. Fresh fruits and vegetables. How adorable. There are no apples or vegetables. Maybe a dried plum from last August, if it hasn't rotted or become home to a worm. Most vitamin C comes from sauerkraut or fermented turnip, affectionately described as a crunchy disappointment in vinegar. Keeps scurvy away, but also friends. Preservation is everything. Everything that ever moved, grew, or was near something that did is salted, smoked, pickled, and dried. Jams are made with berries, if they can be found and not eaten in a sugar frenzy last summer. You hang herbs from ceiling until they fall into the soup one by one like leaf confetti. Nothing is wasted. The bones are boiled twice. The fat is saved. Even ashes from the fire end up in soap or are used to scrub pots. If someone throws away food, you question their sanity. Or you marry him, because it is clear he is rich enough to waste things. And then there is hunger itself. Not mild hunger, not hunger of having skipped lunch, but the kind of hunger that makes you feel your stomach rubbing against your spine. The kind of hunger that makes you chew slowly, not for the taste, but to make it last longer, a hunger that is present all the time in winter. It sits with you, watches you cook, comments on your rations, judges your neighbor's squirrel stew, and says, "Actually, that looks good." There's rhythm. You get up hungry. You go to bed hungry. You learn to live with that feeling of emptiness, as if a mouse were gnawing at your insides. In the end, you stop noticing until you smell stew from a neighbor's cabin and immediately consider selling a brother. Not even the most well-off peasants eat well at all. They only eat a little more of the same, bland, disappointing food. From time to time, someone gets a real delicacy. Honeycomb, slices of fresh apple, a piece of salted meat the size of coin. It is a celebration, not for the flavor, but as a reminder that life is not always horrible. And then come the years of scarcity, bad harvests, crop losses. You remember the winter of 1316, or at least the stories. The heavy rains flooded all the fields. The rot settled in. Grain production collapsed. The cattle died from hunger. Entire villages went hungry. They call it the Great Famine, not for drama, but because it was really that serious. Some people ate roots. Others ate moss. Others, well, let's say medieval cookbooks do not include leather stew for no reason. The monks kept records, blessed be they. They wrote about entire families disappearing, about parents choosing which child would get the last crumb, about people appearing dead in snow hugging turnips, as if they were treasure. It is not folklore. They are forgotten footnotes of history. And when you find food, the fire is out. So you eat cold stew by candlelight, huddled under a skin that still smells of the animal it came from. And you are grateful because at least it's food. At least you can chew something that is not your own lip. Meals are scarce. Hunger is intense. Scrape the plate clean, not out of politeness, but because you need every crumb. You lick your fingers. Scrape the pot. You consider eating the pot. Then you remember that it is the only one you have. Your body changes. You move slower. You lose weight. You don't call it a diet. You call it staying alive. And yet, you keep going. Because hunger is a reality, not crisis. You don't expect to feel full. You just hope not to feel worse. That is winter. It is not a battle, but negotiation between you, your pantry, and the number of meals left until April. There are no festive banquets, unless you're lucky or have good contacts. Maybe you save sausage for Christmas. Maybe a neighbor shares cake, made with mysterious meat and courage. You don't ask questions. You eat, you smile, and try not to cry when it's gone in 3 bites. Even festive meals are practical. Spice beer, if you can afford spices. Nut cakes, if someone has nuts. Cakes filled with dried fruits, soaked in syrup and despair. They are more a ritual than a whim, a way to remind yourself that joy exists, even if it is covered in soot and shared with a dozen shivering relatives. So, what did you eat in a medieval winter? Anything that didn't eat you first. Anything you could preserve, hide, or boil until it stopped resisting. You didn't have dinner. You survived, because in the end, hunger dresses in a wool coat. It wraps you. It stays close. It whispers in your ear. And when spring finally arrives, the first green sprout you see, you don't admire it. You bite it. Your home in the Middle Ages is not a refuge. It is not a sanctuary. It is not, by modern standards, a building. It is rather a suggestion of wooden shelter, carelessly stapled to a dirt floor and held together by good intentions, dry mud, and the tacit agreement that no one sneeze too loudly. Let's start with the walls. Wattle and daub, if you're lucky. They are interwoven strips of wood covered in mud, straw, and anything else around. Cow manure, hair, gossip. You pile it all up and pray that it hardens before the next storm arrives. Spoiler, it doesn't harden. On a good day, the wind whistles through the cracks. On a bad day, the wind howls as if it owned the place and wanted to collect rent. There is no insulation. There is no sealant. There is only the outside and a little less outside. The roof is thatched, of course, which sounds picturesque until you realize it's just dry plant matter arranged in a vaguely triangular shape. It drips constantly. The rain comes in. The snow accumulates. Birds nest in it. Mice settle in and start charging rent. If you're lucky, it only partially collapses during a storm. If you're not, you wake up with a roof in your lap and a chicken on your face. The ground, dirt, just dirt. If it's muddy, you wait. If it's frozen, you slip. If it's dry, it turns to dust and gets everywhere, in your lungs, in your eyes, in your soup. You try to throw straw to soften it, which lasts about 6 hours before it turns into a trampled, moldy paste that somehow smells like feet and despair. Windows. Don't be silly. Glass is for churches and the rich. You have holes. If you're feeling fancy, maybe you stretch grease parchment over the opening. It lets in light and also all the drafts from now until Easter. Curtains. The fabric is too valuable to waste on luxuries like privacy. The doors barely close. The hinges look like wounded animals. You can block them with a log. Or if you don't have logs because you've already burned them to warm yourself. Perhaps you only have to wait for the wind to not be in a bad mood. The chimneys are fundamental, but not in a cozy way. There is a stove. It is in the middle of the room. There is no chimney, just a hole in the roof. So the smoke rises slowly and fills your house with a charming gray fog that covers the walls, the lungs, and any hope you had of breathing pure air until springtime. After a while, you no longer smell smoke. You're the smoke. Now, let's talk about furniture. You don't have much. A wooden bench, maybe a stool, a table if you live large. The beds are shared with your spouse, your children, and sometimes the cattle. The mattress is straw stuffed in a sack, which sounds good until you remember that straw doesn't stay fluffy. It compresses, gets moldy, and attracts insects. Your pillow is another sack. If you're lucky, it's full of feathers. If not, it is just more straw, perhaps a bit less crunchy. The blankets are wool, if you have them, or skins if some animal died nearby recently. Most nights you sleep with your clothes on, covered with all your belongings, hoping body heat and faith will help you survive. And if the fire goes out during the night, you wake up frozen in your own cloud of breath, questioning all decisions that led you to that situation. Heating the house is quite a challenge. You keep the fire lit, of course, but the heat rises, the smoke rises, and unfortunately, you're sleeping on the floor, which means your toes freeze while the beams enjoy a pleasant sauna. The stones around the fire help. They absorb the heat and release it slowly, but only if you have enough fuel to heat them in the first place. You seal the cracks with moss, cloth, or mud. It doesn't work. The wind always finds a way. It always finds a way. There are days when you would swear that the air inside is colder than the air outside, and you want to do something about it, but your fingers are too numb to untie your cape. The lighting is another delight. You have tallow candles that drip, crackle, and stink of cow fat, or rush lamps submerged in animal fat that burn as if someone tried to turn salad into a weapon. The smoke from these mixes with the residual smoke until the entire room becomes a low haze that causes medieval asthma. And let's not forget noise. The thin walls make everything audible. The wind, the cattle, the neighbors' sneezes, the growls of your own stomach as if it were filing a complaint. Privacy, a myth, solitude. Only if you go deep into the forest and do not return. Of course, not only people live here. Your cabin shares space with animals. The hens nest in corners. A goat sleeps under the table. If you have a cow, it lives in the shed attached to the wall, unless it's too cold, in which case it joins you in the main room. There is no inside and outside. There's only not dying of cold. This makes the house a bit warmer. It also makes it noisier, messier, and smells like a stable that has just lost a bet. You sweep floors, but dirt only reorganizes. The straw smells like sour milk. And if a hen decides to lay an egg next to your head in the middle of the night, you thank it and try to go back to sleep before it shits on your blanket. Your roof also houses birds, rats, insects. The straw is thick enough for a nest, which means that when spring arrives, you hear the patter of little feet overhead at all hours. Sometimes they fall down. It's normal. You scream. The rat screams. And then you both pretend nothing happened. The maintenance is constant. The doors crack. The beams bend. The doors warp. The wind tears off the roof. You fix what you can with what you have, which is a weak hope and a very dull knife. You can't afford nails. You wedge things so they don't move. You hammer wood with stone while praying. And if it rains and the roof leaks, you don't grab one bucket. You grab all the buckets. You place them all over the house as if trying to win a sad game of speckled chess. You learn which places leak first. You name them. You curse them. You learn to sleep around them. Not everything is pessimism. There are warm moments when fire burns well. Someone shares a skin. It stops making current for no reason. You convince yourself it's thanks to skill. You snuggle with family and pretend the smell is comforting. It isn't, but it's familiar. Even so, you put up with it because it's not just wood and bad smells. It's your home. It's where you were born, where your children were born, and where someone probably died last week. You fix it, sweep it, whisper to it in winter as if it were a sick relative. Hold on a little longer. You don't compare it to castles. You compare it to not freezing. And, according to that, it's fine. Some richer peasants whitewash walls. Not for luxury, but for the lice. The lime kills insects. A new coat every year keeps the walls bright, and the infestations are, for the most part, cosmetic. Think about doing it. You even collect lime. But then the firewood runs out again. You hang herbs to make air smell better. They dry, crumble, and fall into soup. You eat them anyway. The flavor is strange, but you tell yourself it is the seasoning. It is not. And from time to time you dream of a second room, with a wooden floor, with a ceiling that makes you shudder whenever a breeze rises. You don't expect it to arrive. You simply let the thought accompany you while you sew another patch on the wall and listen to the rain entering through the roof. Because after all, your house is neither warm, nor dry, nor quiet. But it is still standing. And in a medieval winter, That is the closest thing to luxury you are ever going to have. It is dawn, or almost. There's a faint light outside that could be the sun or simply the moon surrendering. In any case, it is time to get up. Not because you have rested. You have not. Not because you are excited. You definitely are not. But because your life depends on you doing things before the freezing, the famine, or your neighbor's goat beats you to the water source. There is no weekend. There is no time for me. There is barely time to remove the frost from your eyebrows. Every day is a repetition of the previous one. Collect, mend, feed, transport, boil, patch, repeat. Winter in medieval Europe is a long list of tasks written with mud, smoke, and fatigue. The first thing is to light the fire. You hope that the embers survive the night. If not, you return to the flint and steel, hunched over the firewood with frozen fingers and breath so visible it could be mistaken for a ghost. The firewood is precious. It is used sparingly. A good fire means heat, food, light, and life. A bad one means that everything above slowly fades while you pretend you're not crying from the smoke. Once the fire is lit, or at least coughing like an asthmatic squirrel, it's time to look for water. The bucket is heavy, the stream is half frozen, and the road is so icy that it could host the worst Olympic event in history, peasant figure skating. You fall, spill the water, curse the ice, the bucket, and the cruel joke that winter is. Then you do it again because the water does not bring itself. Back home, you boil it. Not because you are a health fanatic, but because otherwise it could kill you. Each sip is a bet. Boiling water is also the way to warm your hands, heat the cabin, and delay the feeling of medieval failure for 10 more minutes. Next, the animals. They need to eat before you do. The hens are annoyed. The pigs are noisy. The cow judges you. You gather old hay, food scraps, and everything that is not frozen. You look to see if there are eggs in the hen house. There are none. The rooster, however, has many opinions. If it snowed during the night, you clear the path to the door. Not because it is tidy, but because falling into a pile of snow while carrying a bucket with food for the pigs is the kind of memory that stays etched. You shovel with a flatboard, with your hands wrapped in rags, and you murmur things that would lead to excommunication if someone heard. Once the animals are fed and with fingers half thawed, it is time for breakfast, if you can call it that. Yesterday's leftovers reheated with today's regrets. Perhaps a little stale bread. Perhaps not. If someone remembered to clean the pot last night, you scrape the remains. No one complains. Complaining requires energy. Then comes time for real work. If you're a man, it is tasks of the field, forest, or forge. If you are a woman, it is everything else. Spinning wool, mending clothes, preparing food, cleaning soot, carrying water, stirring the pot, and somehow keeping 6 children alive while pretending your hands are not frozen into claws. Repairing the roof, that is your job. Bringing firewood, that is also your job. Making sure the goat doesn't freeze, escape, or explode. It's still your job. There are no to-do lists, just a continuous stream of crises that need resolving before nightfall. Laundry is once a week, and it is a form of purgatory itself. You drag the clothes to the river, break the ice and scrub with a mixture of ash and lye until your knuckles bleed and your soul leaves your body. You rinse. You freeze. You repeat. Cooking is a game of improvisation and reduced expectations. You stir the same pot you used yesterday. You remove the mold from the surface and add more water. Perhaps some herbs. Perhaps a pebble to give texture. You serve hot and call it soup. The afternoons are for fixing things. Tools, fences, relationships, strained by arguments about who ate the last turnip. You sharpen knives with a whetstone older than your grandfather, who, by the way, died after falling off the same ladder you now use to repair the roof. In theory, the children help. Most get in the way, but even the smallest are assigned tasks. Holding thread, scaring away crows, carrying small bundles of firewood. They work because they have to. Playtime is what happens when they finish early. And nobody finishes early. Inside, the spinning wool turns incessantly. The wool does not spin itself. The linen does not weave itself. Every thread of every tunic has passed through sore hands. Gloves are a luxury. Calluses are common. And if you drop a spindle and it rolls into the fire, you stare at it for a moment and silently consider the possibility of entering the flames to retrieve it. Late in the afternoon, it is already dark. The sun barely peeks out in winter. The shadows lengthen. You hurry to finish the day's tasks before the light is gone. You patch the walls with mud, rehang the door hinges, fix a leaky roof with nothing more than straw, a stone, and utterly misplaced optimism. Then you prepare for the night, stir the stew, stoke the fire, scrape frost from the inside of the water bucket. You put on warmer clothes, which are exactly the same clothes, but with one more layer of sadness. Dinner arrives just as it is: a bit of stew, some bread, a common jug of watered-down beer or water that has been boiled 3 times just to make it less deadly. You sit close, but not too closely. The sparks must not be far, because they can freeze you. You eat quickly. The heat fades fast. Afterward, there is no rest. You keep spinning, mending socks, patching clothes, scraping soot. The children sleep near the fire, entangled and snoring. The adults do not stay awake for pleasure, but because the fire must be taken care of and firewood must be brought for the next day. If you're lucky, there is a song. Someone sings in a low voice while spinning or shelling peas. It is not cheerful, but comforting, a reminder that life still exists outside work, even if barely. Night falls early. You lie down in the same clothes, under the same damp blanket, on the same straw mattress. You listen to wind shake the shutters. You hear the goat fart in its sleep. You hope the roof holds. You hope that tomorrow is warmer, or at least that it will not be worse. You fall asleep in the middle of the night, not because you are calm, but because exhaustion is the only lullaby you can afford. Of course, this is just one day. Tomorrow, you begin again. All tasks are repeated. Each moment is an ordeal. There is no way to catch up, only to fall behind more slowly. Vacations are scarce and deceptive. A free day can mean going to church in cold, standing for hours while a priest reminds you that suffering is good for the soul. Then you go home and catch up on tasks you could not do due to all that spiritual enrichment. The rhythm of life in winter is monotony with risks. You do not do the tasks to feel productive. You do them because not doing them means someone does not eat, does not get warm, does not survive February. The margin of error is microscopic. A broken layer, a lost hat, a broken tool, all are potential disasters. Each task, however small, vibrates with silent urgency. And still you keep going because you must, because no one else is going to carry that water, mend that wool, feed that goat, or boil that gray and slightly suspicious stew. This is your life. This is your winter, and the tasks never end. Sometimes you wonder what it would be like to rest, to truly rest, to sit, to breathe, not to have a list in your head that extends from sunrise to sunset. But rest is luxury. Movement is survival. So you change the logs, fold the wool, calm the baby, and nod to your spouse on the other side of the fireplace. Another day done, another the same to come. The work does not stop, but neither do you. Even when you sleep, your body aches with the memories. The blisters, the burns, the bruises do not heal. They simply become a part of you, like smoke on your clothes, like frost on the windowsill, like the life you never chose but live anyway. You don't choose to get sick during the Middle Ages. You simply wake one morning and realize that your nose won't stop running. Your throat feels like you've rinsed it with pineapples, and someone is inflating your joints from inside. Congratulations. Now you're fighting something that has no name, no cure, not even courteous treatment by the doctor. You're not sure if it's a cold, the flu, or medieval tuberculosis, but now it is yours. Getting sick in winter is almost a rite of initiation. The cabin is damp. The air is cold. The fire went out in the night. And you've been breathing smoke, goat fluff, and spores from the moss on the wall since October. No one yet knows what germs are, but your body does. And now it's throwing a tantrum about it. Everyone coughs. Everyone sneezes. No one covers their mouth because no one has handkerchiefs. And personal hygiene is just a rumor. The children are all sick. The elderly are sick. The cattle could be sick. You stay barely drinking boiled nettle tea and hoping the smell doesn't finish you. The remedies. Oh, you're going to love them. There is blood, of course. It's the remedy for everything, from headaches to heartbreak. Someone shows up with a dull knife or a friendly neighborhood leech and decides the solution to your fever is less blood. Does it work? Of course not. Does it make you feel light enough to forget your symptoms for a while? Yes, actually. Then there are the herbal infusions, mixtures of any dried herbs that the town healer found before snow arrived. Yarrow, wormwood, nettle, maybe a handful of unidentified moss, and a generous pinch of superstition. It is boiled in a cracked clay pot, strained with the sleeve, and sipped slowly. Try to ignore the fact that it tastes like bitter mud and betrayal. Of course, you may also be advised to fast, because it is clear that what a body-fighting infection needs is less food. Bread is already hard to find. The stew has turned into gray sludge. Fasting to spiritually purify oneself is just a way to ration when the pantry looks like an enchanted one. Other remedies include inhaling steam from the same pot in which you just boiled soup. Praying, the longer, the better. And in extreme cases, applying hot coals near the skin to draw out the poison, which works about as well as it sounds. Medical assistance, as it is, depends entirely on who arrives first. If it's the town healer, maybe he'll give you pus and some herbs. If it's the priest, prepare to receive prayers, holy water, and a kind reminder that maybe you brought it on yourself for not going to Mass. And if it's the barber surgeon, well, start writing your will. The barber surgeon arrives with a bag of instruments that haven't seen soap since the last plague. He is cheerfully optimistic. You not so much. He looks at your swollen leg and murmurs something about humors, then pulls out a saw and tank of water. Don't be silly. You will bite a stick and scream into the void like everyone else. Sometimes they prescribe purges, either upwards or downwards, depending on which end is most affected by your condition. Laxatives made from boiled bark or dried beetles. Emetics made with wine and sadness. You are no longer simply sick. You are violently sick, aggressively sick, the kind of illness that makes you question your commitment to life. Even so, some people recover. You spend days lying in your straw bed, sweating through the wool, alternating between chills and hallucinations. The fire is low. The cabin is dark. The air smells of damp wool and whatever herbal nightmare you have drunk before. And somehow you manage. But not everyone is so lucky. The disease spreads rapidly in a small, sealed box full of smoke, livestock, and no ventilation. You cough. Your son coughs. Your neighbor coughs through the wall. In a few days, half the town is cold, gasping, or prostrate under moldy blankets, fed with onion water and receiving the last sacraments in equal measure. No one knows what is causing it, so, naturally, people speculate. Maybe it's the stale air. Maybe it's a curse. Maybe old Maud gave someone the evil eye in church last week, and now the whole street is coughing up blood. Superstition mixes with desperation until you end up hanging herbs on doors, burning dried sage, and sleeping with iron under the bed to ward off evil spirits. It doesn't work, but at least it smells better than the goat. The worst thing is that you can't stop working. You are sick, but you have to cut firewood. You have to milk the cow. Your children are waiting for dinner, even if it's just a steaming dish of hope and nettles. Rest is a luxury reserved for corpses. So you stagger out of bed, wrap yourself in all the woolen clothes you have, and shuffle through the snow like a disgruntled ghost. And all this with the risk that this is not just a sect. May it be the beginning of something darker. Typhus, pneumonia, that kind of thing that doesn't warn. It takes you silently in the night. That is the real fear. Not the pain, but the silence that follows. If the disease worsens, the signs are clear. The fever rises. Your breathing becomes labored. You stop getting out of bed. Someone puts a cloth on your forehead and pretends to be helping. And they call the priest. Not the healer or the barber. Only the man in robes who says it's time to prepare your soul. The confession comes quickly. You murmur all the sins you remember, even those you probably didn't commit, just to cover yourself. The priest nods solemnly and sprinkles you with holy water that smells faintly of mold and despair. He says a few words in Latin. You don't understand them, but they sound definitive. Your family gathers. No one says so, but they are preparing. The pot of herbs simmers. The bread is put away. The blanket is adjusted a bit more. There is a moment, just one, in which you meet your spouse's gaze and realize that neither of you is sure who will survive winter. But sometimes, luckily, the fever subsides. One morning, you wake and the fire is still burning. You're not short of breath. You can move your fingers. The room still smells of decomposing death. But at least it's warm. You've made it by the skin of your teeth, and now the long road back to normality awaits. However, recovery is not glamorous at all. Your legs tremble. Your back hurts. You haven't eaten anything solid for days. And even if you had something, your stomach isn't convinced that it wants it. You get up too fast and almost faint before the fire. Your first outing is like crossing a frozen tundra with legs made of disappointment. No one celebrates you. You simply pick up where you left off. There is firewood to split, layers to mend, and a suspiciously swollen pig to investigate. If your voice still cracks from an infection, too bad. If you've lost a few kilos, well, at least it's a relief for your shoes. And just because you've survived this doesn't mean you're done. The disease never goes away completely. It waits in a corner, in the wind, in the shared cup, or in unwashed clothes. You live in a world where health is a passing visitor, not a resident. Even so, you keep going because there's no other option. You cough less, breathe a little better. You no longer see strange shapes in the corner of the room. The color returns to your face along with the weight of everything that remains to be done. Because in the Middle Ages, disease is free. But surviving, that's an extra. You don't brag about having survived. You don't even talk about it. You simply get up the next day, put on your patch tunic, and carry water again. Because in this world, staying alive is the only proof you have that you were strong enough. And even that, in a winter like this, seems a small miracle. In reality, authority in medieval Europe was not a suggestion. It was a reality, like the mud, the cold, and that neighbor who always smells of pickled turnips. And in the middle of winter, when hunger sharpened patience and tempers flared, obedience was not only expected but imposed. It was not answered. You don't complain. You don't ask why, unless you enjoy the taste of public punishment and splinters. From the lord of the mansion to the local priest, all those above you in the hierarchy expect immediate fulfillment. And they have a belt, cane, or writing ready to remind you of it. Start with the feudal lord. He's the land's owner. Technically, you don't even rent it. You simply live there as a tolerated parasite. You cultivate his fields, pay your debts, and bow when he passes on horseback, even if you already have a broken back. If he tells you to jump, you ask how high and jump anyway, just in case he meant it figuratively. Refuse. How funny. Let's see how funny it is when he finds you, takes your grain, or puts you in the stocks during a snowstorm. By the way, the stocks are the least welcoming seat of winter. Wooden boards hold your arms and neck while your neighbors pass by and admire your bad decisions in life. It's cold. It's humiliating. And if someone is in a festive mood, they may throw something at you. Turnips, if it's good. Stones, if it's not. You don't protest. That could be worth a second round. But the lords were not your only problem. The church was just as powerful and possibly more terrifying. God could forgive, but the town priest, not so much. He saw everything. Who was missing Mass, who worked on holidays, who secretly coveted another's goat. And he kept a record, not only for spiritual purposes, but also to exert pressure. An out-of-place comment, and suddenly you were accused of blasphemy or witchcraft, or, even worse, of forgetting to pay the tithe. Speaking of tithes, they're not optional. You give 1/10 of everything you produce, even if that means you don't have enough left for yourself. Grain, eggs, chickens, even your dignity. The church takes its share. And if you don't pay what you owe, they won't send you a reminder. They give you a sermon in front of everyone, with meaningful gestures and eternal consequences. The preacher's power does not reside in his muscles, but in his memory. He remembers who skipped prayers, who whispered during Mass, who dared to ask why Lent means eating boiled herbs for 6 weeks. And in winter, when everyone is irritable and coughing, it doesn't take much to end up in the firing line of the pulpit. Then there is the law, or what passes for it. The sheriff is usually a farmer with a stick and a vague sense of authority. The laws are not so much about justice as about keeping people in line. Steal bread, lose a hand. Say something impertinent to a noble, lose your tongue. Gossip too loudly, they'll put a muzzle on you. A precious iron mask with a nozzle designed to make you think twice before speaking a third time. Even private matters have public consequences. If your son misbehaves, you are blamed. If your spouse curses, you both suffer. Discipline is a community matter. The whipping post does not care whose idea it was, only that someone receives the blows. And don't get smart. Intelligence in this world is suspicious. Reading is for priests. Curiosity is for troublemakers. If you ask too many questions, someone could accuse you of witchcraft, which entails drowning or a courtesy bonfire. If you are a woman, the rules are even stricter now. You obey your father, then your husband, then your son, in that order. You speak softly, you work constantly, and you never give anyone a reason to point at you and whisper, because once that word is out there, it doesn't matter what you've done. Healing someone, knowing how herbs work, answering questions, is like adding more wood to the fire. And let's not forget your fellow villagers. They are not merely spectators. They're a part of the system. That neighbor who smiled at you in the market could report you for working on a holy day. That cousin who asked to borrow firewood could also casually mention you muttered something profane while asleep. Surveillance is not merely digital. It is human and deeply intrusive. It is a culture of control. Everyone watches everyone, and no one is safe. The cold only sharpens paranoia. The long nights fuel even deeper grudges. A small slight, a stolen tool, a bad deal, a missing hen can escalate to accusations, punishments, and public shame. And there is no appeal process. The closest thing to justice is hoping that your Lord is in a good mood and that your priest hasn't stubbed his toe on the altar steps that morning. Even jokes are dangerous. Say something inappropriate in the wrong tone near the wrong person, and suddenly, your sense of humor is considered evidence of sedition. You can laugh if it is for a joke from the Lord, for the priest's sermon, or for someone in the stocks. Anything else is suspicious. Winter makes everything worse. People are hungrier, colder, and crueler. Punishments are harsher when you already have cracked skin and your spirit is already broken. A slap in summer is an inconvenience. In winter, it is a deep pain that does not go away for days. And without ointments, you can only treat your bruises with snow and silence. There are no town meetings to discuss grievances. There are only orders from top to bottom and obedience from bottom to top. And if you rebel, if you say what you think, defend justice, or ask why Father Thomas gets extra rations every Friday, well, you're earning a punishment that could outlive your usefulness to town. Even animals are treated better if they're productive. A healthy ox is more valuable than an injured peasant. A goat that gives milk is fed before you. Your value is measured by your performance and your obedience, not your opinion. Stay in your place. Shut up. Be useful. That is the unspoken motto. And winter only underlines it with frost. And yet, people adapt. They learn to bow without bending too much. They master the art of polite silence. They feign eyes. Obedience becomes a skill, partly a survival tactic, partly social performance. Children learn early on. They're taught not only to work, but also to act, to speak to the Lord, to avoid the priest's gaze, to stand still at Mass, and not laugh when old Margaret snores during the sermon. They are not taught to dream big. They are taught to be small, to go unnoticed, and not change. Even religion, the supposed comfort in such a harsh world, is used like a leash. You are reminded weekly, sometimes daily, that obedience brings salvation's path. That questioning is a path to hell. That God watches. And also, coincidentally, Father Thomas does, who seems too interested if you kneel enough during prayer. At night, the town is still. Not at peace, just quiet, with a silence that weighs heavily. You hear the crackling of the fire, the moan of the wind, and the occasional footsteps of someone returning home from the tavern. You remain still, wrapped in wool and fear, and think how obedience has kept you alive today. Not happy, nor free, but alive still. Tomorrow, you will wake and obey again. Not because you believe in the system, but because your survival depends upon it. The price of winter is submission, and everyone pays, whether they want to or not. You don't question cold. You don't question rules. You simply put on your boots, bow your head, and move on. Because in the medieval winter, questioning authority isn't rebellious. It's suicidal. Not even your thoughts are entirely your own. You mold them carefully, keep them silent, hide them behind your eye's gaze. Because in a world built on obedience, even thinking freely seems a dangerous luxury. So you obey, endure, and wait for spring's arrival. Because in winter, even rebellion freezes, and you have enough to survive as to add heresy now. So you lower your gaze, close your lips, and continue like all others. You're not alone out here now. And I don't say it in a comforting sense. The one that is said when offering hugs. It is the one that your inner voice whispers when something is out there in forest and the door isn't closed properly. Because in the medieval winter, you are surrounded by things that want your food, your warmth, and sometimes your face. Wolves are the most obvious concern now. In December, they're hungry now. In January, they become bolder. They prowl the edges of forest, closer now than in summer. They raise their snouts toward the smoke from your chimney's top. They smell meat. They smell fear. They smell you. And when you walk alone, perhaps to look for firewood, perhaps to empty the trash can, they watch you. Sometimes they follow. They rarely attack directly, but you have heard many stories. Everyone has heard them now. Some say they wait for you to slip, for your lantern to go out, for your boot to get stuck in snow, and you fall face down in silence. Then everything ends quickly now. Or not so fast, maybe. But wolves aren't the only ones watching. They're smaller, quieter, stealthier predators, and often they're already inside here. Rats don't care about cold. They have settled right in. They hide behind the sacks of barley, scurry under the straw beds, and gnaw on anything remotely edible and some things that aren't. You have heard them at night. The growls, the scurrying, the occasional screams of someone who discovers that a rat has made its nest in the pile of dirty clothes. They eat grain, soap, and leather. They gnaw shoes, belts, and the bindings of the only book in the town. If it can be gnawed, they will gnaw it. And when food is scarce, when it is really scarce, the rats become something more than a plague. They become a test of what you're willing to kill in the name of dinner. The cats help when you have them. But a good mouser in winter is worth more than a son, and they know it. They behave like little monarchs in the cabin, demanding warmth and respect to reduce the vermin population. If they don't feel like hunting, bad luck. The rats resume their midnight buffet, and you wake to find something missing a piece. Then there are the dogs. Not all of them are friendly. Some are stray dogs from town, half wild, with broken ears and ribs showing through fur. Most were abandoned when food grew scarce. Now they roam in scattered packs, sniffing doors, chasing chickens, and sometimes cornering someone too slow to shut the door. You don't trust them. They don't trust you. They bark at ghosts and sometimes at nothing. But when they're hungry enough, barks turn into bites. In the forest, you have heard rumors of lynx. Rare, though not impossible. A blur of fur and claws disappears before you can be sure it's real. Mostly they avoid people. Mostly. But if one appeared in town, no one would be surprised. Just bad luck. The bulls are worse. Big, evil, and stupid. They don't hunt you. They charge. Especially if they're cornered or desperate. You have heard of men who have lost their legs or their lives because of the tusks of a wild boar. In the harshest months, some still try hunting them for food. Sometimes they come back with dinner. Sometimes they don't come back. And when you think the outside is bad, remember the inside isn't much safer. The cold draws more than rats inside. Spiders, beetles, centipedes, bugs that crawl and crunch underfoot come in search of warmth. You step on them barefoot at dawn and try not to scream. You sweep them toward the fireplace and watch them sizzle. Then you stir the soup again as if nothing happened. If you store food for the winter, dried meat, apples, cheese, or salted fish, you protect it as if it were a treasure, not because you're greedy, but because you're competing with everything that breathes. The mice are relentless. The mold spreads faster than your fingers can scrape it. And the family dog, if you have one, has started staring at the laundry room door as if it was made of dreams. Some families hang food from the beams to keep it safe, which works until something climbs the wall and steals it. Anyway, you have found half-eaten sausages on the floor, small bites in the bread, and worse, excrement in the flower pot. You clean it, close the lid, and pretend it can still be used. Because waste is a luxury, and you cannot afford it. Even the birds get strange with cold. The ravens seem to follow you, perched on the roofs, watching from the fence posts, in silence and waiting. You tell yourself that it is superstition, but then you see 3 of them on the same beam above the main door, and you wonder if they know something that you do not. Winter sharpens everything. The sound spreads farther. Steps in the snow resonate louder. When you hear something outside, breaking branches, low growls, or the rhythmic crunch of approaching boots, your heart does not accelerate. It stops because sometimes it is not an animal. Sometimes it is a person as hungry as a wolf and twice as desperate. The bandits do not take vacations this season. They are colder, hungrier, and more reckless. If they believe your family has food, they may try to open or knock down the door. That is why you sleep with a knife near the bed, dull, rusty, but sharp enough to give you a chance to fight back. You pray never to have to use it. And so, each noise becomes a question mark. Each gust of wind, each creak in the ceiling, each blow against the wall. Is it just the cold settling or something trying to enter? You start to learn the language of winter. The way snow falls when something has moved, the silence that means something is watching. You listen differently. You think differently. You start counting food by days, not weight. You put your hands under your arms when you're not working, not because it is cold, but because freezing does not ask permission and you never lower your guard. Because predators do not knock on the door. They do not announce themselves. They simply arrive with sharp teeth, claws out, as cold as the season itself. The church can preach that God takes care of you even in winter. But God does not patrol your henhouse. He does not drive rats out of the basement. And he does not leave footprints in the snow right before your door. So you check the locks. You make a double knot in the rope. You leave the fire on and the knife within reach. And when you sleep, it is a dream interrupted at the slightest noise. Half rest, half alert. Because winter is not only cold, but alive. It is hungry, and it is always on the prowl. In the mornings, you look for footprints. Not out of curiosity, but necessity. A single line of footprints in your garden means something has passed through. Perhaps only in passing, perhaps exploring. Sometimes they are foxes sniffing around the henhouse. Sometimes it is something worse. You remove the snow from the road, not only to walk safely, but also to erase footprints, so that your house seems less tempting to what may be watching from the trees. Some people hang amulets over their doors. Pieces of bone, carved wood, twigs of dried herbs. Protection, they say, against animals, spirits, bad luck. Nobody knows if they work, but nobody dares remove them. Your dreams become strange. Teeth, eyes, heavy steps. You wake sweating, with your breath fogging the cold air. And you listen, just in case. Because winter in the medieval world tests not only your strength, but also your sanity. It puts your nerves on edge, steals your sleep, and makes you lose any feeling of security. Each dark night feels like a challenge. Each howl a reminder. Out here, you are not at the top of any food chain. You are just another creature trying to survive the cold. So you keep moving forward, with your eyes open and the doors closed well. Because in a medieval winter, staying warm is only half of the battle. The rest is making sure nothing devours you before spring arrives. And if something is hungry enough, it won't care if you have prayed, if you have prepared, or if you have hidden well. It will simply come, and you will have to be prepared because, in a world like this, even rebellion freezes. When the food runs out, toes go numb, and the roof drips more than it covers. There is only one place to go. God, or more specifically, the medieval church, which, depending on the day, is your salvation or just one more mouth that asks you for something. Religion in the Middle Ages was not optional. It was oxygen. It filled every hour, every room, every thought. Especially in winter, when death felt closer than ever and plagues appeared uninvited. You didn't just believe in God. You structured your life around the idea that he watched you and that he was not very happy. The church not only offered comfort, it offered rules, rigid rules. You attended Mass, even if the church was colder than outside. You fasted when ordered to. You confessed things that you were not entirely sure were sins. And if you didn't, the consequences were not only spiritual, they were social. People noticed, people talked, and nobody wanted to cause the harvest spoiling or the fever spreading. The church building was no refuge. Stone walls, dirt floors, a draft that seemed to head straight for the spine. You huddled next to your neighbors, trying not to tremble too much so they wouldn't accuse you of weakness, while the priest, wrapped in robes and spiritual authority, recited in Latin, a language that no one understood. But you nodded anyway because it wasn't about understanding. It was about obeying. Mass was not interrupted by weather. If the river froze, you crossed it. If your son had a cough that looked like the devil himself had settled in his lungs, you wrapped him and took him with you. Missing Mass was not only frowned upon. It was noted by the priest, your neighbors, that old woman who never blinked and always sat in the first pew. And let's not forget the tithe. 10% of everything you had or were supposed to have went to the church. Not 10% of what you had left. 10% of everything. It didn't matter if your family lived on turnip broth and boiled oats. The Lord still needed his share. Apparently, heaven had expenses. During the winter, religion was not just a ritual. It was a theater of survival. People prayed for everything. For heat, food, health, for the strength not to strangle their in-laws after 3 months locked up by snow. Each problem had a saint. A sick cow, San Eligio, frozen fingers. San Policarpo probably lost your axe in river. San Antonio lost his head trying to survive January. San Dimner, patron of those who barely stay afloat. And then there were relics, bones, teeth, splinters of supposed crosses, handkerchiefs that once touched someone holy. These were kept in display cases, silver boxes, or anything that could be made from melted spoons. People walked with difficulty through snow and mud for kilometers just to see one, kiss it, and whisper a prayer. Not because they fully understood theology, but because they had no other option. Miracles, at least in theory, were always possible. You could heal. Your baby could recover. Your pig could stop foaming at the mouth. And if none of that happened, well, maybe it was your fault for not believing enough, or for that. Unconfessed sin that you pretended didn't count because it had happened in dark. Confession was a kind of winter ritual. You knelt in a wooden confessional with frozen knees, quietly whispering your sins to a man who already suspected what you were going to say. The priest did not flinch. He had heard worse things. There had always been adultery, theft, envy. The time you accidentally ate bacon on a fasting day. You said what you had to say, received your penance, and left the confessional feeling a little lighter until the guilt reappeared 5 minutes later. And then came the fasting, Advent, Lent, the saints' days, without meat, without eggs, sometimes without dairy in middle of winter, when you had already gone a month without tasting meat, and the last egg froze before you could break it. You huddled over your sad stew made with what had not yet gone moldy and called it a sacred sacrifice. But you didn't dare question it. The church was everywhere. It owned land. It controlled the calendars. It collected fees. And it explicitly told you that everything you endured in this life would be worth it if you followed the rules. And if you didn't, the eternal fire, not the metaphorical fire, the real fire, the fire that burns and screams forever. That is what awaited you if you made a slip. Time was in itself a sermon, a sudden storm, a warning from God, a streak of mild days, the mercy of God, a frozen harvest. Someone had sinned. Who? It was not clear, but someone. This turned the towns into moral pressure cookers. Neighbors watched neighbors. The widow who muttered too loudly during Mass. The man who skipped Vespers. The child who asked too many questions. Any of them could be the reason the goats froze. The line between spiritual and social punishment blurred rapidly. Gossip spread like frost across field. Whispers were heard. She doesn't kneel properly, or I saw him working on Saturday. In the blink of an eye, you found yourself in the center of a prayer circle or an accusation. And while your extremities froze, trying to be a good person, the priest lived somewhat warmer. He was not rich by noble standards, but he was definitely in better shape than you. He had wine, real wine, a private room, possibly a feather pillow. And he often reminded you that your suffering was part of God's plan, which was convenient for him, but not so much for you. But you kept listening, because what else could you do? Hope, however faint, was the product that the church sold best. In a world where your son could die of a cough and your neighbor could disappear under a collapsed roof, heaven offered a cruel comfort. If this life was nothing more than mud, hunger, and cold, then surely the next would be better. Golden streets, warm light, no freezing, no rats. You clung to that vision, not because it made sense, but because it had to, because otherwise you would only be surviving for the simple fact of suffering, and that was too much for anyone to admit aloud. You carved small crosses into the beams above your bed, whispered rosaries in the dark, tied amulets to your belt, saints to protect you, saints to sleep, saints not to die before dawn. Each small ritual was a rebellion against despair. You could not fix the cold. You could not solve the hunger. But maybe you could remain in God's grace long enough to see spring. And that meant keeping the faith. Even if your knees bled from kneeling so much, even if your prayers were not answered, even if deep down you were not sure that anyone was listening. And when someone died, which was frequent in winter, it was the church that guided their body to rest, or tried to, since the ground was frozen. The graves had to be opened with picks or left shallow and marked for later. The priest murmured in Latin. Over a shroud covered in frost, the incense froze in the air as the living buried the dead with reddened fingers and numb faces. Sometimes the body could not even be moved. A makeshift service was held in a barn or right there in the house, while relatives huddled next to the wrapped body, praying that it would not attract wolves before morning. But the church also had answers for that. Death was a step, a test. The cold could not follow you to heaven. The hunger would end. The pain was temporary if you believed, and if you obeyed. So even the worst moments, kneeling in a church so cold, with your breath fogging the hymnal, confessing sins just to feel some control, praying to a saint whose name you barely remembered. You kept going because faith in the medieval winter was not just a matter of salvation. It was a matter of survival. And when the cold howled harder, it was not fire or food that kept people standing. It was the quiet hope that someone, somewhere was listening. Because in a world ruled by frost and famine, faith was the last thing. That could not be taken. There is a lie that people like to believe about winter, that it ends in March, that spring arrives like clockwork, just when it is most needed. The flowers bloom, the birds return, the sun spreads its golden fingers over the wheat fields. But in the Middle Ages, winter did not care about calendars. It arrived when it wanted, left when it was over, and sometimes it did not leave at all. March could be as cruel as January. It kept snowing. The ice remained stuck to the eaves as if it had paid rent. The wind kept howling and the sun remained low, pale, and deeply useless. Mud replaced the snow, but that did not mean that life was easier. It just meant that the boots weighed more. Spring was a rumor. Hope was a dangerous luxury. When the snow finally melted, the damage was already done. The earth advanced, yes, but the people did not advance. What winter did not freeze, it killed with hunger. What did not kill with hunger, it broke. Bones, tools, spirits. Some families got thinner ahead. Others did not get ahead at all. If you entered the city in April, you found doors still closed, chimneys still cold, without smoke, without footprints, only silence. The kind of silence that means someone did not make it. Maybe it was the old man whose cough never improved. Maybe it was the woman who gave her bread to her children until she did not have enough for herself. Maybe it was the child who got sick in February and slowly faded away. Funerals were quiet ceremonies, if they were held at all. At the end of winter, the cemetery had filled faster than anyone expected. The ground was too hard to dig properly for most of the season, so sometimes bodies were wrapped and stored in barns or caves until the ground could be broken. They were smelled before being seen. And even if you survived, there was not much to celebrate. You did not start singing when you saw a crocus. You looked at the earth as if it owed you something. As if, perhaps, if you waited long enough, it would give something back. Food, hope, a reason. Spring was not a joyful rebirth. It was a slow, muddy crawl out of the grave in which you almost slipped. You were alive, yes, but different. A little quieter, a little thinner. You laughed less. You trusted less. You had seen what hunger could do, what cold could steal, what despair could turn people into. You did not talk about it. Not directly, but you saw it in others. In the way people flinched at loud noises, hoarded crumbs, stared at piles of firewood, as if counting them like coins. You could tell who had seen someone die. You could tell who had buried their loved ones. And the hunger did not end just because winter was over. Your supplies were empty. Your cattle were thin. Nothing had grown yet. It would be weeks, even months, before the fields would feed you again. Until then, there was only waiting left. You boiled the same roots. You baked the same bread, as hard as stone. You hoped that the rains would come and not another frost. And then there was the work. Winter did not kill you only with hunger. It broke your tools, rotted your thatched roofs, collapsed your sheds. Spring meant fixing everything. Fences, roofs, wheels, muscles. You had to patch, plant, cut, haul. There were no breaks, just new tasks piling up on top of the old ones. You planted seeds with your fingers still cracked by frost. You dug the ground while coughing up the last gasps of a January illness. You did all this while pretending you were not still hungry, that you were still in mourning, that you were still having dreams in which something with your brother's face chased you barefoot through the snow. The records of the time, when they exist, speak more with silence than with statistics. The parish records enumerate who were buried, but not the reasons. The chroniclers write of hard times, of unusual mortalities. They do not mention that a town of 60 inhabitants could be reduced to 40 in April, that 10-year-old children seemed 20, that women aborted because of the cold. What we know is that this medieval winter was not something that could be overcome. It was something that was survived in the truest sense. One made it to the other side, not unharmed, not whole, just breathing. And even that was rare. No one spoke about the trauma. The word did not exist. But the symptoms were present in each lost gaze, in each child shuddering with the wind, and in each man who woke up screaming in the middle of the night. You were expected to move on, to rebuild, to feel grateful. But some people did not move on. Some stopped talking. Some drank more. Some prayed more. Some simply faded away. They worked in the field without speaking. They ate without savoring. They looked at their families as if they were strangers. They too were survivors. The church offered an explanation for some things. Divine tests, tribulations, purification through suffering. But even that began to seem insufficient when your baby did not wake or your mother was buried with a Thor. The will of God only goes so far before it sounds like a shrug. But even so, you kept going because there was no other choice. You fed the chickens. You fixed the door. You taught your surviving child to distinguish if the flour had gone bad. Life resumed not because it improved, but because no one told it to stop. And finally, one day in late May, something green appeared. Not much, just a sprout. Probably a weed, but still. It was enough to stop and look, enough to feel for a moment that the world could soften again. Spring did not erase anything. It only buried it under new tasks and fainter shadows. The losses remained. The silence remained. You remembered all the names that did not survive. And when the thaw revealed things lost in the snow, a boot, a rusty knife, a girl's doll, you picked them up gently and said nothing. In time you would hear laughter again. Quiet, cautious laughter around a new fire next to a pot with something a little more edible. They would not last long, but it was something. A child could chase chickens around the yard. Someone could play a melody with a broken flute. The smell of damp earth and sprouting grass replaced the stench of mold and death. It was not joy, not yet, but it was movement onward. And that was the most that could be asked. You did not expect happiness, just less pain. You learned to plant early, to store better, to prepare with more strength. But you also knew in the deepest part of your bones that the next winter could be worse. It was only a matter of time. And so you lived with scars, with stories, with cautious hope. You did not talk about the worst because what was the point? Everyone had their own version. Everyone had frozen fingers, buried relatives, or nights in which they were unsure of waking. You passed in front of the cemetery and did not linger too long. You saw the new sprouts and felt old pain. And when someone asked how winter had been, you only nodded. You said, "We have made it," because that was what everyone said. The truth was longer, more complicated and colder. It lived in the corners of the room, in the way you wrapped yourself in the cape, even in the sun, in the way you counted food twice, in the way you listened to wolves, even in spring. Survival was not triumph. It was only resistance. But in the Middle Ages, that was enough. So you cleaned your hands, fed the fire, planted the next seed, and waited for the cold to return. Because in an age in which there were no promises, nor heat, nor food, nor tomorrow, surviving winter was the closest thing to a miracle that peasants had. And for the majority, there were no songs, nor records, nor legacies, just another spring and the silent proof that they were still there. Because surviving did not turn you into heroes. It only meant that you were still standing when the snow finally yielded. And that, in the medieval winter, was the only victory that mattered. One more breath, one more season. Resist.